Residents of Florida will never forget that day. A bear killed a group of students. However, what caused this traffic accident? Watch as we examine this startling case in greater detail. It was meant to be a simple trip, one that would allow the students to step away from the chaos of city life and immerse themselves in the tranquility of Florida's natural beauty. A routine field excursion planned by Dr. Edward Richardson, the professor in charge of the university's environmental science course. For weeks, the students had been preparing, eagerly anticipating the break from lectures and assignments. Their goal was to study the unique flora and fauna of the Everglades, to observe how the ecosystem functioned in real time, and to experience firsthand the wilderness that had been preserved in the heart of Florida. It was an opportunity for practical learning, a chance to connect with nature in a way that textbooks could never replicate. Little did they know, nature had other plans for them. The group, 15 students in total, departed from Miami in the early morning hours, their excitement palpable as they loaded their gear into a fleet of rental vans. They talked eagerly about what they hoped to see: rare birds, alligators, perhaps even a glimpse of the elusive panther that roamed the swamps. The air was thick with humidity, and the promise of an adventure felt tangible as they made their way southward, their collective anticipation rising with every passing mile. The drive itself had been uneventful, the landscape gradually changing as they moved further from the urban sprawl, the looming skyscrapers of the city replaced by wide stretches of flatlands and thick forests. When they finally reached the Everglades, the dense vegetation welcomed them. The guides they had hired for the trip, seasoned professionals who had spent years studying the Everglades, led them into the heart of the wilderness. There was a sense of awe among the students as they stood on the edge of the swamp, looking out over the vast expanse of murky water and tall grasses that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. After setting up camp near a wooded area on the outskirts of the park, the students settled in for the night. They had chosen a relatively isolated spot, away from the main trails, hoping to get a more immersive experience in the wild. The tents were quickly erected, campfires lit, and the smell of food filled the air. The students, in their excitement, hadn't noticed the shifting currents of the wilderness around them. The subtle changes in the wind, the unfamiliar rustling of the trees, the way the night seemed to grow unnaturally still. It was already late when the bear first made its presence known. No one saw it at first. At that time, they were still adjusting to the surroundings, laughing and talking around the campfire, the light from the flames flickering off their faces. But then, Sarah Jenkins, a quiet student with a deep love for nature, decided to venture out to gather firewood. She had always been the adventurous type, unafraid to wander off and explore. She walked a short distance from the camp, her flashlight casting long, shaky shadows as she picked through the underbrush. It was during this brief moment, when the night seemed to hold its breath, that she unknowingly crossed paths with the grizzly bear. The animal, a massive hulking creature, had been wandering through the Everglades for days, drawn southward by an instinctual need to find food. It had traveled far from its usual northern habitat, its usual territory lost to environmental pressures, encroachment from human development, the destruction of forests, the disappearance of its prey. Hungry and disoriented, it had ventured into new territory, a place where it was unfamiliar with the scents, the sounds, the rhythms of the land. But it was the scent of humans, of food, that had drawn it deeper into the swamp, toward the camp of the unsuspecting students. The grizzly, startled by Sarah's sudden presence, froze for a moment in the shadows. It was far from the dense woods it was used to, but the smell of the fire and the remnants of their meals had overridden its caution. It had learned that the human presence meant an opportunity, a chance for sustenance. When Sarah saw the bear, her flashlight beam catching the reflection of its eyes, there was no time for fear, no time for thought. The bear, driven by hunger and an instinctual desire to claim its territory, lunged at her. Her scream split the night, a raw, terrified cry that echoed through the trees. It was the only warning the others would get. The moment they heard Sarah's scream, panic set in. Dr. Richardson was the first to react, shouting for everyone to run, but it was already too late. The bear was upon Sarah in an instant, its powerful claws swiping at her body with terrifying precision. She had no chance to escape. Her cries were cut off abruptly, and the night fell silent once more, save for the distant growls of the bear. Chaos erupted. The students, frightened and confused, scattered in all directions. Some of them froze, paralyzed by the terror of the situation. Others sprinted toward the camp, hoping to find safety in numbers. Dr. Richardson, with a survival instinct that kicked in despite the confusion, tried to gather them together, shouting for them to make noise and scare the bear off. But the panic and disarray only made the situation worse. The bear, now fixated on the group, was relentless. Its hunger and aggression had only been provoked further. In the scramble to get to safety, the students made critical mistakes. They ran blindly into the woods, breaking apart from one another, separated by the thick underbrush and the disorienting darkness. The bear, sensing the fear and hearing the clumsy movements of the students, began to pursue them, its powerful legs carrying it swiftly through the tangled mess of trees and swamp. It was a predator on a hunt, moving with a terrifying calmness that contrasted sharply with the frantic chaos of the students around it. By the time the first of the students had reached the clearing, the bear was already on their heels. The animal's attack was brutal and merciless. It didn't stop to savor its kill. It simply tore through them, ripping at the flesh and dragging them into the undergrowth. One by one, the students were taken, their screams muffled by the dense canopy of trees above them. Those who tried to climb trees to escape were not safe either. The bear, its primal rage unstoppable, clawed and swiped at the base of the trunks, knocking several of them down with terrifying ease. The students realized quickly that there was no escape from the predator that had found them. The hours stretched on, marked by the sounds of struggle and fear, but the wild had already taken its toll. By the time the last of the students found shelter in a small cave nearby, there were only a few left alive. The rest were either dead or critically injured, their bodies left behind as the bear stalked the remaining survivors. No one knew how to escape. The world outside the Everglades seemed impossibly far away, and their cries for help were lost in the wilderness. The group was now caught in a nightmare that none of them had ever imagined, surrounded by an animal they could not defeat, in a wilderness that held no mercy. This was no longer a camping trip. It was a fight for survival, and for many of them, it would be too late. The bear had already claimed its prize, and the students of the small Florida university were now just another tragic part of its journey. The incident, which had begun as a simple academic trip, had become a grisly and haunting tale of nature's power and the fragility of human life. The sun had barely begun to dip below the horizon when they first saw it. At first, it was just a distant shape, moving awkwardly through the dense swamp. The students, still wrapped up in their discussions and excitement about their upcoming activities, didn't notice it immediately. It was only when the shadows lengthened and the light of day began to wane that something felt off. They'd been in the Everglades for several hours now, the humidity pressing down on them, their senses heightened by the unfamiliar environment. The air around them was thick with the scents of earth and water, the hum of insects incessant in the background. Every now and then a bird call pierced the stillness, or the snap of a twig signaled the movement of something large within the brush. But nothing had truly disturbed their peace yet. They were too caught up in the novelty of the experience, in the excitement of being so far from the urban world they knew. Dr. Richardson, the professor, was at the head of the group, his gait confident as he led them through the tangled undergrowth. The students, a mixture of undergraduate and graduate level, followed in pairs, each lost in their thoughts, or deep in conversation about some aspect of the Everglades they had yet to understand. The guide, an experienced ranger named Thomas, moved quietly behind them, ensuring that they didn't stray too far off the path. He was a seasoned professional, accustomed to leading groups through this fragile ecosystem. His presence provided comfort, a reassurance that even the most dangerous creatures of the swamp could be avoided with the right knowledge. It wasn't until they reached a slightly elevated patch of land that the first sign of danger appeared. The land here was drier, the underbrush less dense. It was a perfect spot to stop for a break, and Dr. Richardson called out for the group to gather. They spread out, some taking a seat on fallen logs, others resting against the trunks of large cypress trees. The guide, too, sat down on a nearby rock, scanning the horizon. It was then that Sarah Jenkins, a quiet, observant student who had always been drawn to the natural world, noticed something moving in the distance. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the low sun, a bird flitting through the brush. But as she stared longer, the shape became more defined. Her eyes widened, and she instinctively motioned to her friend Riley to look. Riley turned, his eyes squinting as he tried to see what had caught her attention. It was large, far larger than any animal he'd seen so far in the swamp, and it was moving steadily, its shape partially obscured by the trees. There was no mistaking it now. Something was out there. Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady, not wanting to alarm the group. Riley, however, was already on his feet, trying to get a better view. Slowly, the rest of the group began to take notice, their conversations dying down as the sounds of movement in the distance caught their attention. Some of the students had already gotten their cameras out, thinking it was another alligator or perhaps a deer, but there was no mistaking the sheer size of the creature moving through the thicket. As it came into clearer view, the students' first reaction was one of disbelief. It was a bear, a massive, hulking grizzly, its fur thick and dark, its movements heavy and deliberate. It was far from the usual wildlife they had been expecting to encounter in the swamp, where smaller creatures like alligators, snakes, and various birds made up the majority of the fauna. The bear moved with a kind of unsettling calm, as though it were completely unaware of the humans standing in its path. Its large head turned slowly as it scanned its surroundings, its dark eyes gleaming in the fading light. For a moment, it stood still, just watching the group, its presence almost surreal in the otherwise peaceful setting. The students froze, unsure of how to react. Some took a step back, instinctively understanding the danger, while others stood mesmerized by the sight of the animal. Thomas, the guide, was the first to break the tension. He moved swiftly to the front of the group, his voice low but firm. "Stay calm, everyone. It's just passing through. Don't make any sudden movements." But the bear did not seem content to pass by. Instead, it began to move toward them, its lumbering gait slow but purposeful. The students remained still, but their hearts were pounding in their chests. They had been taught that encounters with wild animals like bears were rare, and that they should always remain calm and avoid provoking them. But in that moment, standing in the shadow of such a massive creature, those lessons seemed insignificant. Dr. Richardson watched the bear closely, his mind racing as he tried to assess the situation. He had no experience with grizzlies. His expertise lay in the study of smaller creatures, the ones that typically populated the Everglades. But he knew enough to recognize the danger in front of him. This was no ordinary black bear that might flee at the first sign of human activity. This animal was different. It was large, powerful, and, from its lack of immediate flight, potentially hungry or territorial. He called for the group to back away slowly, urging everyone to stay calm and move in a single direction, not to scatter. The guide's advice echoed in the back of his mind. Stay together, don't panic. It was the only strategy they had. They couldn't afford to make the bear feel cornered or threatened, but the bear didn't retreat. Instead, it moved closer, and the students, despite their training, felt the icy grip of panic claw at them. There was something unsettling about the way it approached, its movements too deliberate for comfort. Its eyes were locked on them now, its nostrils flaring as it took in their scent. The reality of the situation settled over the group like a heavy fog. The peaceful, idyllic experience they had imagined was quickly turning into something far darker. The bear was no longer just an observer. It had shifted into something else. Something driven by an animalistic need, a hunger, or perhaps a curiosity that wasn't easily dismissed. And as it closed the distance between them, the students' calm was slowly unraveling. Each step it took seemed to slow their own breathing, the very air growing dense with the weight of impending danger. Dr. Richardson gestured for the students to move back even farther, his mind racing through the protocol for situations like this. But before anyone could take another step, the bear stopped, its massive head swiveling as it caught something. A sound, a movement, A shift in the air. It paused for a moment, its eyes narrowing as it began to assess the group more intently. The bear, large and intimidating, was now within a dangerously close range. There was no mistaking its intent. It wasn't afraid, and it wasn't leaving. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned away, retreating into the brush as quickly as it had come. The tension didn't leave immediately. For what felt like an eternity, the group remained silent, waiting for the bear to return, to charge, to strike. But nothing happened. The bear had simply vanished back into the swamp, leaving the students trembling, their minds still trying to process what had just occurred. It wasn't until Dr. Richardson made the decision to move the group back toward the camp that anyone could finally breathe again. But even as they gathered their things and began walking back to their campsite, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had come face to face with a predator, and it hadn't been an accident. Something had shifted in the wild. The bear, for reasons they didn't understand, had chosen them as its next target, and deep in the shadows of the Everglades, it was watching them. The night descended quickly, the dense canopy above swallowing the last remnants of daylight. The oppressive humidity hung heavy in the air, sticking to their skin like a suffocating cloak. The camp had been set up hastily, each student trying to shake off the anxiety that clung to them after their strange encounter with the bear. Despite the guide's assurances that they were safe for now, the tension among the group was palpable. A primal fear had taken root in them, and no amount of firelight or reassurances could fully dispel the growing sense of unease. Dr. Richardson had tried to keep the group engaged, setting up the campfire and talking about the area's history, but his words seemed hollow, devoid of the authority they had once carried. The night sounds of the swamp, usually so calming, now sounded foreign and unsettling. The chirps of crickets seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the distant rustling of branches in the wind felt more like something stalking them than the natural movements of the forest. The only thing that broke the silence was the occasional snap of a twig or the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the trees. As the darkness deepened, so did the feeling of isolation. The firelight flickered erratically, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to move in rhythm with their fears. The students huddled around the fire, some with their heads down, lost in their thoughts, while others kept scanning the edges of the camp, expecting the bear to return. The guide, Thomas, had moved to the edge of the camp, standing guard. But even his calm demeanor couldn't allay the growing sense of vulnerability. The bear had not been some curiosity. Its intentions had been clear. And now, in the silent dark of the swamp, the sense of impending doom was thickening by the second. It was then that the noise came. Low, at first, almost indistinguishable from the usual creaks and groans of the swamp. A rustling sound. And then, unmistakable, the thud of something large moving through the underbrush. A chill ran down everyone's spine at once. It was too close, too sudden. Every student froze, the sounds of their breathing the only thing they could hear. Then the brush at the edge of the camp gave way with a violent snap, and the first heavy footfall of the bear hit the ground. There was no time to think. The bear burst through the trees with a terrifying speed that defied its size. Its immense form came crashing into the clearing, its jaws already open, its teeth gleaming in the firelight. The sight of it, so monstrous and unrestrained, triggered a wave of panic that swept through the group like wildfire. The students screamed, some leaping to their feet, others stumbling backward, tripping over logs or their own feet in their frantic attempts to flee. But it was too late. The bear's attack was brutal and immediate. It lunged toward the nearest student, a young man named Eric, its powerful forelegs swiping him off the ground with terrifying ease. His body hit the earth with a sickening thud as the bear's massive claws raked across his chest. Eric's scream was drowned out by the sounds of the bear's growls, and then the savage tearing of flesh. The group was too paralyzed by fear to do anything but watch in horror as the bear's powerful jaws closed around Eric's torso, crushing his ribs with a sickening snap. The air was filled with the sound of blood spraying, the metallic scent overwhelming as Eric's life was snatched away in an instant. It was a moment of utter chaos. The firelight flickered wildly as students scattered in every direction, but the bear was unstoppable. It had already tasted blood, and its instincts were locked onto the next target. It charged after another student, a girl named Ava, who had fallen to the ground in her attempt to run. She barely had time to scream before the bear's massive paw struck her square in the back, sending her sprawling forward, her limbs twisted unnaturally as she collided with the dirt. The bear moved in a blur, its snout lowering to her neck in a savage, predatory motion. The sound of bones snapping filled the air as the bear tore into her, ripping at her throat as she gasped for breath, her blood pooling around her in the dark, sticky soil. Panic was now pure, unadulterated terror. The students were no longer thinking, only reacting. Some ran toward the swamp, hoping to find refuge in the water, but the bear was relentless, cutting them off at every turn. Others tried to climb trees, their movements frantic and desperate, but the bear was too fast, too strong, too powerful to be outmaneuvered. Its dark eyes locked onto each new target with the certainty of a hunter who had no intention of stopping. The night had become a nightmare, a frenzied dance of death where the only rule was survival. One by one, the students were picked off. The bear's bloodlust seemed insatiable, its savage strength tearing through them with terrifying efficiency. It swiped at a group of 3 who had tried to make a break for the fire pit, its claws slashing across the air and catching one of them, a young man named Ben, square in the chest. His body was flung back like a rag doll, and the other 2 barely had time to react before they were swept up in the same savage onslaught. The bear turned with terrifying swiftness, its eyes scanning the remaining survivors with a chilling sense of satisfaction. Thomas, the guide, had been trying to circle around behind the bear, drawing on every ounce of his survival knowledge. He knew the swamp better than anyone, and he was desperately trying to find a way to stop the creature before it killed them all. But there was no time for strategy. The bear was too quick, too powerful. He barely managed to make it to the edge of the clearing before the bear turned on him. It saw him coming, and with a speed that shocked him, it lunged. Its jaws closed around his shoulder with a sickening crunch, and he was thrown to the ground, his body crumpling beneath the weight of the attack. The bear's strength was overwhelming, and though Thomas fought with everything he had, his cries for help were swallowed by the sheer brutality of the assault. Amidst the carnage, there was no escape. The students who had managed to hide were discovered one by one, the bear hunting them down like prey. It didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. The attacks were sudden, relentless, each one more brutal than the last. The night, which had started with a sense of adventure, had transformed into something unrecognizable, an unforgiving battle for survival against an unstoppable force of nature. As the blood began to soak into the earth, the sounds of the struggle grew fainter, swallowed up by the swamp's endless, suffocating expanse. The bear, its hunger momentarily sated, stood over its fallen prey, the chaos of the attack slowly quieting as the silence of the night crept back in. Only a few of the students were still alive, scattered, broken, and barely conscious. But the bear had made its point. It had marked the night, and it would not be forgotten. The Everglades, dark and ancient, had reclaimed its dominance, and the swamp would never be the same again. The carnage was unfolding at an astonishing pace. The few students who had managed to avoid the bear's immediate onslaught were now trapped in a nightmarish fight for survival. The distant cries of their peers echoed in the stillness of the swamp, but none of them dared to approach the clearing where the bear had made its savage assault. The air was thick with the smell of blood and fear, and the sound of the beast's growls reverberated through the trees, leaving no doubt in anyone's mind that it was not finished. Among the survivors, panic had reached a fever pitch. They scattered, running blindly through the dense undergrowth, their eyes wide with terror, hearts pounding in their chests. The darkness that had once seemed like a veil of comfort now felt like a cloak of death, suffocating them as they stumbled over rocks, roots, and jagged branches. The swamp was an unforgiving maze, the thick vegetation a constant obstacle, each step a battle to maintain any sense of control over their actions. Every sound in the night was amplified, every rustling leaf or breaking branch a potential signal of the bear's next move. The students didn't have time to think, they could only react. their minds consumed with the singular goal of escaping the predator that was relentlessly hunting them. Ava, who had barely managed to escape the initial attack, was one of the few still conscious. Her body was bruised and bloodied, her legs shaking from the shock of the attack, but her instincts had kicked in. She knew she had to keep moving or she would be next. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward, barely able to see through the thick fog of panic that clouded her mind. She couldn't focus on the pain or the terror. There was only the primal drive to survive. She stumbled forward, her hands scraping against the rough bark of trees, her feet slipping in the wet mud beneath her. The noise of her own movement was deafening, her heart hammering in her chest, but she didn't dare slow down. Behind her, the bear was hunting. It moved with a terrifying patience, its senses heightened by the bloodshed it had already caused. It had tasted the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of its power, and now it was savoring every moment of the hunt. The bear's massive form moved silently through the swamp, its dark eyes scanning the foliage, its keen nose sniffing the air for any trace of its prey. It didn't need to rush. It knew the survivors couldn't outrun it, and the sounds of their frantic flight only served to draw it closer. The students who had scattered were now separated, isolated in the wilderness. Thomas, the guide, had managed to crawl toward a small copse of trees, his body racked with pain from the bear's earlier attack. He knew he wouldn't last long. His left arm was nearly useless, crushed under the force of the bear's grip, and his vision was growing blurry from blood loss. But there was no time for pain. He couldn't afford to pass out, couldn't afford to let the darkness take him. He had to think, had to survive. He pulled himself to his feet, leaning heavily on a nearby tree for support, and stumbled forward, trying to put as much distance between himself and the bear as possible. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and regret. How had this gone so wrong? They had come to the Everglades for an adventure, to learn about the wild, to study the creatures that called it home. They had all been excited at the prospect of seeing a bear in its natural habitat, and now, here they were, fleeing for their lives, hunted by the very creature they had come to study. He had been trained for situations like this, had been told what to do in the event of a bear attack, but none of it had prepared him for the sheer ferocity of this creature. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Too fast, too strong, too ruthless. There was no escaping it. The minutes dragged on like hours, each second stretching out as the survivors tried desperately to stay alive. Some had managed to find shelter in the dense thickets of the swamp, trying to keep as still as possible, hoping the bear would move on. But the bear was relentless. It was never fooled by their attempts to hide. It moved with an eerie sense of purpose, tracking each movement with its unblinking gaze, always just a few steps behind. Ava had found a narrow crevice between two rocks and wedged herself into it, her body trembling uncontrollably. She could hear the bear moving through the swamp, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. Her heart was racing, the sound of blood pounding in her ears, and she forced herself to stay as quiet as possible, praying that the bear wouldn't find her. But her hopes were in vain. The bear's head appeared from around a tree, its massive frame blotting out the little light that filtered through the canopy. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Ava's stomach twisted in horror as the bear moved toward her hiding place, its eyes narrowing in on the gap between the rocks. She could feel the cold breath of the beast as it drew nearer, its massive paws scraping against the ground as it advanced with slow, deliberate movements. She pressed herself against the rocks, willing herself to disappear, but the bear was already too close. It reached out with one massive paw, batting at the rocks with a force that shook the ground beneath her. She flinched, her body frozen in terror as the bear's claws scraped across the rock with a deafening sound. She held her breath, praying that the rocks would hold, that she would be overlooked for just a moment longer. But luck was not on her side. The bear let out a low growl, its dark eyes locking onto her hiding place. With one final swipe, the creature knocked the rocks aside, revealing her small, trembling form. There was no time to scream, no time to fight back. The bear lunged forward with terrifying speed, its jaws opening wide, its teeth gleaming in the moonlight. Ava's vision blurred as the creature's weight slammed into her, knocking the breath out of her lungs. It was over. The fight for survival continued, but it was becoming clear that, one by one, the students were falling. The swamp, once a place of beauty and mystery, had become their tomb. The sounds of the struggle were fading, each scream swallowed by the darkness. The bear had claimed its territory, and there was no room for mercy. In the end, only a few survivors would remain, their bodies broken and battered, their spirits crushed by the overwhelming violence of the night. The Everglades had taken its toll, and the students, no longer full of curiosity and wonder, would be remembered as nothing more than another casualty of nature's ruthless power. The struggle for survival had been lost. The morning after the carnage broke with an eerie quietness that seemed unnatural against the backdrop of a forest still dripping with the remnants of the night's violence. The sun crept up slowly, casting a cold, pale light over the swamp, its rays barely breaking through the thick mist that clung to the ground. The world seemed suspended in a moment of calm, but it was a deceptive calm, one that concealed the horror that had unfolded just hours before. The search for the missing students began in the early hours, once the authorities had arrived and organized their teams. They were a group of seasoned rescue workers, law enforcement officers, and biologists, all experienced in wilderness survival and search and rescue operations. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to encounter. The swamp had always been a place of mystery and danger, but today it had turned into something else. Something far darker, far more insidious. The search began with a methodical sweep of the area. The team moved through the dense undergrowth, scanning the ground for signs of the missing students. They called out into the fog, their voices strangely muffled by the thick air. The silence that greeted them in return was suffocating, broken only by the occasional distant cry of an animal or the soft rustling of leaves. The swamp felt like a living entity, one that seemed to be holding its breath, as though it knew something the humans did not. The air was heavy, laden with the scent of decay and rot, a reminder of the violence that had transpired here just hours before. As they pressed deeper into the swamp, the first signs of the carnage became evident. It was subtle at first, nothing more than a few broken branches, disturbed foliage, and the occasional smear of blood on the ground. But as they continued, the evidence grew clearer, more disturbing. A torn backpack, half submerged in the mud, a shoe, discarded carelessly, its sole covered in thick red stains. The signs were unmistakable now. Something had gone terribly wrong. The team moved with urgency, their steps quickening as they came across more and more disturbing clues. A fragment of clothing caught on a branch, fluttering in the breeze like a sad, ghostly flag. A set of tracks, large and deep, imprinted in the soft earth. They didn't need to be experts to recognize that these tracks didn't belong to any human. They were unmistakably the paw prints of a bear, a large one. As the search continued, the team began to piece together the fragments of what had happened. They found more bodies, lifeless and mangled, some barely recognizable, others torn apart beyond belief. The brutality of the bear's attack was evident in every mangled form, the marks of its claws and teeth still visible on the broken bodies. Some of the students had been dragged into the brush, their remains scattered like discarded playthings. Others had been killed outright, their bodies left where they had fallen, blood pooling around them, the final sign of the savage violence they had endured. But it wasn't just the bodies that left an indelible mark on the searchers. It was the atmosphere of the place itself, the heaviness of it, the palpable sense of danger that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. There was no comfort here, no relief. Every corner of the swamp felt alive with menace, and every creaking branch or snap of a twig made the searchers jump, even if just for a second. The bear's presence was everywhere, even if it wasn't physically there. It had left its mark, and now the swamp was its domain. As the day wore on, the team grew weary. The physical toll of searching through the thick, oppressive terrain was beginning to show. The humidity weighed heavily on their shoulders, and the constant vigilance required to stay alert to every sound Every shift in the environment drained their energy. But there was no time for rest. They had to keep moving, had to find the last of the missing students. It wasn't until late afternoon that they stumbled upon the final clue. A small, hidden clearing deep within the swamp, almost impossible to spot unless you knew where to look. The trees around the clearing were twisted and gnarled, their roots digging deep into the earth like ancient fingers, as if trying to hold the place together. The clearing itself was eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation. And there, in the middle of the clearing, was something that froze the searchers in their tracks. A large, bloodied carcass lay motionless on the ground, its body torn apart, its face unrecognizable. But it wasn't just the grotesque image that sent a chill down their spines. It was the way the body had been arranged. It was as though the bear had left it there deliberately, an offering, a statement of some kind. The students' bodies had been brutalized, scattered like so many pieces of a puzzle. But this body had been left in a way that made it feel like a warning to anyone who dared to venture too far into the bear's territory. The team stood frozen, unable to move at first. The sight before them was beyond comprehension, beyond anything they had ever been trained to handle. It was as if the bear had turned the swamp into a slaughterhouse, its viciousness unmatched by anything they had ever encountered. And then, as if to confirm their fears, the faint sound of movement came from behind the trees. The bear was still out there. The realization hit them all at once. The creature hadn't just been hunting, it had been territorial, marking its ground, making sure that no one would forget what had happened here. The search wasn't just about finding the missing. It was about surviving, about escaping a predator that was still prowling the same ground they were walking on. They had found the remains, they had found the evidence, but they hadn't found the bear, and they hadn't found all the bodies. There were still students out there, still lost in the swamp, still vulnerable to the monster that had taken their lives. The searchers looked at each other grimly, realizing the full scope of the nightmare they were in. This wasn't just a hunt for survivors. It was a hunt for the truth. A truth that was becoming more chilling with every step they took deeper into the swamp. The search would continue, but it was clear now that they weren't just fighting the clock. They were fighting a force of nature, something that didn't follow the rules of human understanding. The Everglades had turned on them, and there was no telling what it would demand before the final discovery was made. The aftermath of the attack was both harrowing and disorienting. The quiet that fell over the community in the days following was palpable, a thick, mournful silence that seemed to stretch over everything. The families of the victims were left in shock, unable to comprehend the brutality of what had happened to their loved ones. News outlets flooded the region with stories, and soon the world became aware of the horrific event that had unfolded in the Florida Everglades. Investigators scoured the site, piecing together the events leading up to the deadly encounter. Forensic evidence, including the bear's tracks and DNA, confirmed that it had been the predator responsible for the deaths. Authorities also discovered signs of territorial behavior, suggesting that the bear had been provoked into an unusually violent response. The investigation revealed an unsettling truth. This bear, normally elusive, had crossed paths with humans in a way no one had anticipated. As the bodies were recovered and the investigation continued, the mystery of why the bear had acted in such a frenzied, calculated manner remained unanswered, leaving a sense of unresolved fear lingering in the air.